Okay, so thanks very much for choosing to come along to this session. My name is Sebright, and I'm the Head of Media and Internal Communications at the London Fire Brigade. And this afternoon I'm going to talk to you a bit about, well, that title suggests that social media is a fifth emergency service. I'm going to question that slightly, talk a bit about how we've been using social media. But hopefully what I'm going to talk about, even though I'm speaking as somebody that works for a fire and rescue service, is going to be relevant to all of you in your organisations as well. Do come forward and grab a seat. Okay. Right, so I'm going to kick off with my first slide. In fact, I might just wait a couple of minutes because there are some people walking past. Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to kick off my first slide, which will hopefully tries. So, is this a code pink emergency? So I'm starting with a bit of an odd slide, but I thought it would be a bit easy for me coming along from a fire and rescue service to begin with a picture of a fire and talk to you about social media in terms of how we use it in relation to emergency incidents. This will make sense as we go along, I hope. It's certainly not that we're diversifying into Ann Summers at all. We're certainly not looking to rebrand the London Fire Brigade as a softer shade of pink. And you're probably wondering why on earth, as the head of communications at the London Fire Brigade, I've chosen to start my presentation with a picture of a pair of pink handcuffs and a pink set of hair straighteners. But as I say, hopefully as we go forward, this will make sense. So why do we use social media? Well, I've got some figures in front of you, which I'll take you through. Because in order to understand why the London Fire Brigade uses social media, you have to understand our business and what we're needing to say at the moment. So to start with, our London Fire Brigade in 2012-13 received 178,000 calls. Of those, around 25,000 were to false alarms. So fire crews actually attended those number of false alarms throughout that year. Again, of that 178,000, 20,000 were actual fires. And of those, around about 11,500 were serious fires, what we tend to call primary fires. And then there are 9,000 small fires and 45 fatalities related to fire. I'm just going to pause there for a second and ask you what you think of those figures. It's not really a trick question, it's more an observation from the audience. Any thoughts?
What are all the other calls?
Okay. I could certainly provide you with lots of information about the number of incidents and the different types of incidents that we attend. Those are just a sort of a brief overview of some of the key things that stand out. And if you like, those are the higher figures from something called our London Safety Plan, which exists and includes details of all the different types of incidents that we attend. But there are two ways of looking at these figures. The first is that they're very real. In terms of why the London Fire Brigade exists, well, we attended 20,000 actual fires in that 2012-2013 period. So in terms of what we've got to do as an organisation, it's pretty much there for you to see. But also, and I wondered, which is why I'd opened it up to the floor, considering we do serve 32 London boroughs and 33 London boroughs and the City of London, it's actually, in some respects, quite low figures, especially when you do look at those serious fires. And in terms of coming back to the question about why we use social media, we have all of that we need to be talking about. And the next slide, so there's a brief sort of snapshot, I'll take your point that it's not everything, but there's a brief snapshot of what we actually do in terms of figures. And then there are different figures. So in terms of our money, for the same period, the London Fire Brigade cost £420 million. We're actually pretty good value compared to a lot of other services, I think. Certainly if you were to stand us up against the Metropolitan Police Service, which is much larger, but also if you were to look at the likes of Transport for London. In terms of what we cost per head, there's a figure there of £49.76. It's actually come down. It was £57 in 2010-11 and £51 in 2011-12. So we're steadily coming down and still providing good value for money. We've already saved £71 million over the last few years. And most of those savings have come from, if you like, back office. Lots of people don't like us referring to that. Most like it to be known as the non-operational staff. So we're not necessarily talking about firefighters or fire stations. We're talking about something called fire rescue staff. But we've still got to save £45 million over the next 2 years. And for anybody that's been following the London Fire Brigade story closely, you may be aware that we're looking to close 10 fire stations in January 2014, which will provide around about £35 million worth of savings. And even with that saving, you can still see that we've got further savings to come. So I've given you a very brief snapshot of the number of incidents that we attend, just so that you get a feel for what the London Fire Brigade actually does. And I've also given you a slide there on some of our financial situations in terms of the savings that we need to make. So what's that got to do with social media? Why are we using social media? It's got absolutely everything to do with social media. Because in terms of needing to talk to people about emergencies so that they know what's going on, in terms of being able to talk to people about how to avoid fires in emergencies, the number of figures that I gave you there at 45 in 2012-13 is still significant. Any fatality is one too many. But it's halved in the last 10 years, and we need to keep that downward trend. We need to talk to people more to let them know what to do in a fire to help us keep that downward trend. And we need to explain to people what they're getting for their taxpayers' money. So in terms of the £49 per head that I gave you there, we need to be explaining to our public what we're actually doing. So in terms of why we use social media, well, it's really around picking up from all of those points that I've just made. It's around accuracy. It's about making sure that whatever is going on in social media terms is actually coming from a verified source. We do have the blue tick on our Twitter feed, and we do have a very established following now. It's about reassurance, not only in terms of accuracy around, there aren't actually 40 fire engines there, there are 4 fire engines there. There's obviously the reassurance that we are actually there, we are actually down the bottom of the road dealing with this incident. There's an awareness of what to do in a fire. I mentioned that one of the reasons for using social media was actually about if you do have fire or how to prevent fires. We can use the channel to get that information out. It's about a better understanding of what we do. So, in terms of, I'll use Twitter, everything ranging from firefighters rescuing people from the side of the building where they perhaps got trapped. One of our examples was the Shard, where a couple of window cleaners got trapped, a very high profile, very high building. And we were able to actually use our social media feeds to talk about what was going on, especially with a building where you might be concerned about what else might be going on. But also for incidents ranging from firefighters pulling people out of the mud right the way through to what we'd expect most of the time to see, which is firefighters dealing with fires and road traffic collisions. So it gives a really full, broad understanding of what the London Fire Brigade actually is doing. And coming back to that point about value for money, it's something we've never really been able to do before. And we're part of the conversation. Frankly, we can't be accurate and reassuring and give all of those things if we're not actually part of what's going on. So we could stick our heads in the sands, but that'd be a bit silly, especially at this advanced stage of social media and how it works. So by being there, we can clarify, we can correct, and we can also pick up on concerns and certain behaviours in the way that people respond. But the real USP of social media for us, because that's all quite straightforward in terms of how most organisations are using it. Any guesses? Okay. I really just wanted to put Lady Gaga in a London Fire Brigade social media presentation, but she's supposed to represent influence. So in terms of being able to influence, we've been talking about fire safety for many, many years. We've been talking to people about where they should put their tea lights, and we've been talking about how they should install smoke alarms, how they should test them. The real selling point for social media is actually how people use it, how we reach people that we've never been able to reach before, and how they in turn talk about what is going on and share their points of view. So, coming back to for those of you that missed it, I had a slide up at the very beginning of a pair of pink handcuffs and a pink hair straightener. So to bring you back to why the handcuffs were there, we had a situation where the number of 999 calls to people being trapped in slightly difficult circumstances were going up. Coming back to my point about the types of incidents that firefighters are being sent to, when they could be at other types of incidents, and coming back to my point about the savings that we need to make, you can see that with those types of incidents, we need to bring them down. So we cheekily jumped on the back of the 50 Shades of Grey story that has been running at the beginning of the year. So before we were talking about Miley Cyrus and twerking, we were talking about 50 Shades of Grey. We nicked it and we launched 50 Shades of Red. And what we actually did was we used Facebook and Twitter to talk about some of the incidents that firefighters had been called to. Most of those incidents causing people to go 50 Shades of Red. It was slightly cheeky. It was obviously using humour. But there was a very important point to be made that this, along with people being trapped in lifts when housing providers should be fixing lifts and rescuing people from lifts, not firefighters, to a range of other types of incidents that firefighters are being called to. And again, I'll come back to what we're here for and the financial situation that we find ourselves in. So by launching this story, just a few of the figures there, I could have provided you with many, many more, and I'm very happy to, for anybody that's interested. In terms of our Facebook, it was seen by in terms of impressions, 47,000. Now, I've been very lazy, actually, and I've not got a latest set of figures on these. So this was at the time of the campaign, which ran back in the summertime. Just in terms of Twitter followers, and I will never stand in front of you and say that the number of Twitter followers alone means very much, but going back to the influence, talking about how people share information and how they talk, we had an increase of 3,000 and couldn't keep up with the conversation, if I'm honest, in terms of what was going on Twitter. And coming back to our website, we had 30,000 visitors to the Brigade website in a day, which for us is quite significant. We sort of tend to stumble around the sort of, well, certainly less than 10,000 figures, even on a very good day. So for us to get 30,000 visitors to the Brigade website in one day was a success. And they're just three of the pieces of information I can give you about how this campaign worked. And it was really turning on its head what people tend to expect from the London Fire Brigade. And it did everything that we expected it to do. It got people talking. And it got them realising that, these are certainly things that even if they are going to continue to happen, you shouldn't perhaps call the Fire Brigade if you get trapped in those circumstances. So far, we're not talking huge incidents. They've gone from 52 in August to 45 in September to 31 in October. It's not a huge one, but it goes to show that in terms of if you're taking certain campaigns like this to your chief executives, you are able actually to show that there has been a downward trend in the number of incidents that we are being called to. We hope that continues. This is just an example of how we can use social media. I mentioned people trapped in lifts, to be on a slightly more serious note. The number of incidents that we get called to are ridiculous. There is a real message there that housing providers need to be maintaining lifts and actually responding to people trapped in lifts rather than calling the London Fire Brigade. I will just mention as well the hair straighteners, which is another example of where we had circumstances where people were leaving hair straighteners on and they were causing electrical fires, and those were again significantly on the increase. And by running some simple messages about not leaving your hair straighteners on and putting out some real case study information about what happens when you do, we generated an awful lot of following, including 63,000 shares, over 2,500 likes, and over 1,500 comments. And in that instance, the Facebook story was actually seen in terms of impressions 4 million times on Facebook. So again, it might sometimes seem that it's a fairly light subject. but these incidents do happen. They do require London Fire Brigade resource. In the case of the hair straighteners, they do cause a significant number of fires. And I think one of the things I would say on all of those is that what we're using is a slightly turning on its head what people would expect to get from the London Fire Brigade, and we're certainly using humour. We're engaging with our target audiences. Young professionals had 1,500 fires in 2012. I would say that on the whole, what tends to happen is that people go out for a good evening, get a bit tipsy, go home, decide to get the chip pan out, and have all sorts of complications with fires. So we know that these sorts of behaviours, that's just one, but we know these sorts of behaviours cause fires, and what we're in the business of is not just responding to fires when they happen, but actually looking to change the behaviours that cause them in the first instance. So just a few figures there, and I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this stuff. So 33 million Facebook users, over a quarter of whom are aged between 25 and 34. 15 million on Twitter, with over 60% using mobile. And consumers themselves, the use of mobile data more than doubled in the last 18 months to January 2012. Forgive me, I'm sure there is a more recent figure. But coming back to why we use social media, we've been doing communications for many years before my time at the London Fire Brigade, but by using social media, we're able to reach an audience that we hadn't tapped into before, who are then using our information, talking about it amongst themselves, and sharing that information. And some of those figures, the reason I've given them to you, is to really prove just how far they are actually shared. And we're achieving results. I've mentioned that we have a strong following, but it's really the impressions and the public recognition that counts. And in terms of the case studies, they really do show the viral spread of information and safety messages. It's the sort of stuff that years ago we would have probably had to spend a lot of money advertising to get some of those messages spread so far and wide. And actually, the best thing about social media is that the people that are following us are interacting it and doing it for us. And also, in terms of the increase of the traffic, it's certainly something that hasn't gone unnoticed by us at the London Fire Brigade. The traffic to our website has gone from, the overall, and bearing in mind we get around about 1.2 million, 1,200,000, I think it is, in 2011-12, and that's gone up to 1,500,000 in the last year. And the traffic to our website has gone up 2.3% of all the visits in 2011 to 9.2% of all visits in 2013. And that's traffic from social media feeds to our website, just to be clear. So it really is having the benefit. We are measuring, we are monitoring the impact, and we are then looking at what sits on our hub, on our website, in terms of if somebody does pick up on a tweet that has involved a tea light candle, they're taken to a page about candle safety, and not just a flat page about candle safety where you're told to put it on a heat-resistant surface, but perhaps something more interactive to keep people there and to avoid quick bounce rates where people come and go very quickly. That's still something we're working on. It's not like we haven't got the resource at this stage to develop that as far as we'd like to, but it's certainly something where the results speak for themselves. A little bit about how we've done this work at the London Fire Brigade. We've done it very much using in-house resources. We didn't start in 2010 with a strategy and decide that we needed to employ a social media team because we didn't understand what that was. We didn't understand what a social media team would actually do. But we did start with a really clear set of objectives. A lot of organisations tend to use social media and go out there and think, well, just see how it goes. We'll talk about pretty much everything. Get a free home fire safety visit, phone this telephone number. We started out by using Twitter, for example, to communicate incident information to our followers. And we learned very quickly that that's what people wanted to see. We know that the two reasons that people come to our website is to work for us, to become a firefighter, and to find out about incidents, because we're all a little bit voyeuristic, and also there's that interest. It's what's out there, what's going on down the road with the flashing lights. So we've been using Twitter very much to talk about incidents, sometimes straying off slightly, and sometimes having a bit of fun along the way. I've referred to humour already. But generally, still to this day, we know that that's a feed where people trust that the London Fire Brigade, a verified source, is actually talking about what's going on, And we can pull people back, as I've already mentioned, to our website to find out more about how they can prevent those incidents actually occurring in people's own lives. I mentioned developed by existing communication staff. There are actually 5 members, excellent members of the communications team who do a brilliant job. They are, if you like, by trade press officers who have developed social media skills and have really worked very hard over the last few years to add a whole range of skills to their CVs, and they've done a brilliant job. Working with IT, access and impact on systems. So you can imagine that a few years ago when I went into certain rooms at the London Fire Brigade, people weren't quite sure what I was talking about in terms of how on earth Twitter and Facebook and the likes could benefit the London Fire Brigade. But certainly working with IT, we managed to give access to all staff, including firefighters based at 112 fire stations. Because there's really no point in using social media to communicate, especially community safety messaging, to our public if our staff aren't able to see what we're doing. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, well, like most public sector organisations, we use the free tools. We use Google Analytics, we use Twitter tools, and obviously any of the tools that are available using our systems. So with our intranet, it's pretty limited, and as I've already mentioned, Google tools for our website. But it's incredibly important to be able to do the monitoring and evaluation and report back on a monthly basis what's working and what's not just because of the benefit of how social media and some of the figures that we've been able to share have really blown people's minds in terms of the, for example, 4 million people seeing a hairspray this message. But also just in terms of the monitoring itself, it is really about using that information to look at what we put on our website and what quality is it? Is it rich content? Is it stuff that's going to make people stick around? We've shared the impact with decision makers, and that's for us been a really big task in terms of working with borough commanders who are responsible for fire safety and partnership working within their boroughs. They have to work with their community safety councillors to talk about fire safety in the borough. And it's something that's still got to improve because there's so much that our staff have to do that actually taking them out to do lots and lots of training on social media isn't that easy. But it's certainly, and I'll come to that in a moment, something that we need to look at in the future. But it's definitely something that right from the start we needed the Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner and the Directors to be on board with. They needed to understand this and they needed to actually let it go and see how it worked out and trust us. And actually letting go is something that I seem to be saying an awful lot in the first year of social media. It is about breaking with the rules, which for a organisation that is based on rules and on processes is quite a difficult thing to achieve. But it was important that they understood how it worked. And getting noticed for what we do. So we have put ourselves up for awards, and we have won those awards, I'm very pleased to say, based on the impact of what we're actually saying. But getting noticed again is a way of actually revisiting with stakeholders and decision makers why it's so important to carry on. Moving forward, we've actually included in our safety plan, our safety plan is called the London Safety Plan. All fire and rescue services have to have an integrated risk management plan. And in our integrated risk management plan, we do actually have a strategic objective, which is that we will utilise social media to encourage behavioural change, provide increased ways to access our services, help protect people from fire, and help them to avoid travel and business continuity interruptions of fire. So it's quite a bold thing for us to include alongside all of the things you'd expect to see in a London Fire Brigade plan on how we're going to respond and protect Londoners. But it goes to prove how much our decision makers have actually recognised the importance of social media, and we've made a commitment now to develop it further. Recently, we were we were the only fire and rescue service to actually go with the launch of Twitter alerts. So Twitter themselves have obviously been doing lots of development across the world and have launched in Japan and USA Twitter alerts, whereby organisations could sign up to issue urgent alerts during a major or catastrophic incident. And I must stress that this is for major and catastrophic incidents. This isn't to say that there's been a spate of hair-scraping fires. This would be that has been some form of dreadful incident, whether it be terrorist or otherwise. And the idea is that people sign up for Twitter alerts, and that if the London Fire Brigade has responded to a major terrorist incident, a tweet would go out to those followers. It would also go to their mobile phones as a text, and it would also appear at the top of their Twitter flow of stories, regardless of when it was posted, so that they get that information. And I think it's a sign of how organisations are actually recognising the importance of social media during incidents, including major incidents. And it's very interesting that Twitter themselves have actually worked on developing this system and then worked very hard to join up with services including the Metropolitan Police Service, the London Ambulance Service and the London Fire Brigade. But we actually joined together, and that they provided the research and the resource to actually develop these systems that we then benefit from. Thankfully, we've not had to use this yet, but when we do, we'll see the impact for the very first time. And as I say, these are major incidents that we're talking about. We're quite pleased that London Fire Brigade was obviously in right from the very start. Certainly in terms of our work to warn and inform, this is crucial. So what happens now? Well, we're reviewing after 3 years. We expect to expand our use of social media. I've already mentioned borough commanders, etc. We will warn and inform and monitor how emergency incidents are being shared. And we will develop, as part of our digital offering, mobile access. We're looking at the moment at the redesign of our intranet, so that it's future-proof to be accessed using mobile devices. And certainly when we redesign our website, we'll be looking at doing that too. So, it's a really brief run-through of what we're doing at the London Fire Brigade. I hope it's useful. There are a few things there in terms of, if you don't already, it'd be interesting to follow us at London Fire and give us your feedback. Also follow us on our Facebook page and let us know what you think. We've used YouTube, Blipper even, QR, and Instagram, and we'll keep playing with those systems to see whether or not they benefit us. So do follow us. And at that point, I'll open it up for any questions. Oh, I think I need to pass you the microphone.
Hello, Catherine Howe from Public Eye, and thank you, because I do think what you guys do is to sort of way out there in terms of best practice around use of social media. And I'm really interested in to what extent is your ability to make progress with the use of social media being connected to the sort of the refocusing of the Fire Brigade's priorities generally around prevention over kind of like putting out fires. And so actually, have you been able to kind of go with the weft of the fact that social media, viral behaviours, behaviour change all really, really resonate with your shift in strategic direction?
Absolutely. I think that one of the sort of beauties of social media for us is that it just lends itself, as hopefully I've been able to share, so well to what we're trying to do. We've spent many years developing different systems and different ways to engage with the public, catch their imagination and get them to think about the implications of fire. And using social media, we're really able to engage. So, obviously we're limited in terms of our resource. We can't respond to every single tweet or every single Facebook comment. But it has definitely focused us, and the statement that appears in our London Safety Plan highlights just how important it's become as a communications tool. I'd always argue that it's not a standalone. It's not as though we've dumped traditional media or internal communications or marketing. But it is very much part of our suite of communications. And certainly some of those staff I mentioned, the borough commanders, for example, understand that this is how the public communicate. One of the questions we've had to ask ourselves even is, what do we do if people start to use social media to actually report emergencies? We're a bit away from that at the moment, and we do quite clearly say at the moment that people should dial 999. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, as a forward-thinking organisation, be thinking about how we're going to respond to those things. But certainly in terms of the discussions that happen around some of the incidents that occur, and I think we have to be realistic in terms of it is usually the light-hearted approach that matters. And that's quite important because it's a tone of voice that we've not really been able to use before. So we still have our traditional press releases detailing what's going on at an incident, in the way that you would expect in terms of the operational information. But we can sometimes be slightly more light-hearted or go into details we wouldn't necessarily have gone on. And I think that, just coming back to your question, where that's really helped is the tone of voice of social media hasn't been challenged by our organisation. So we've been able to break away from the sort of traditional operational approach to communication. Any other questions? Anything at all? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I think I've probably finished a wee bit early, haven't I? Or where am I time-wise?
Well, can I ask you about that?
Yeah, sure.
What are the lessons that you've learned from doing what you've been doing?
I think in terms of, we were quite lucky in terms of the way that we began using Twitter, for example, because we didn't stray into other types of work. We've always used it to talk about incidents, and after a couple of months it became obvious that that was working quite well. I think where we have sometimes had to think is where we've used social media and it's sort of spawned conversation that we're not really able to deal with on those platforms. And there's been a certain amount of being realistic about how far we can go on those platforms. I mean, there are ways of dealing with social media and not necessarily shutting down conversations, but perhaps taking them offline. So one of the things that we did right from the very beginning was make sure that our guidance and our rules on Facebook and on use of Twitter were communicated, and that certainly for our staff, the guidance on how staff should use social media, as opposed to how staff should not use social media, were clearly communicated, so that if people did say things and do things that they shouldn't do, bearing in mind who we are and how we have a responsibility to the public that we serve, there were some very clear guidelines there that we could refer to and then hopefully take things offline. So I think that that's one of the things that we did sort of learn in the first year of using social media. Also, I've mentioned humour, but we've had some complaints. So there have been people that think it's inappropriate that the London Fire Brigade is talking about fluffy handcuffs and hair straighteners in that way, in a slightly flippant way. And I think one of the learnings there is the importance of measurement and being able to demonstrate just how far a message has gone that once upon a time you'd have had to pay an awful lot of money to get people to take notice of, and that sometimes it's just worth the risk. Is that?
Well, I was interested as well in asking about what the buy-in was from senior management originally. Did you have to really push this, or did you just kind of do it under the radar, or were they supportive? And also, I mean, the guidelines is interesting, guidelines for use for, because I had a quick look at your Instagram there as well, and you actually have some pictures of people, some of your workers, basically some of your firemen, and I was interested in that, because some people take an approach whereby you should get various different levels of your organisation tweeting about what they do, so that people get to understand that. And I was wondering how you approached that and what the buy-in from your firemen might have been.
In terms of, I mean, what we haven't done is said that we'd like all 6,000 firefighters in London to start tweeting. In fact, I think a big percentage of them would laugh at me and say, "Are you serious? There are lots of other things that you could be telling me to do from a communications perspective." I mentioned that what we have said to them is that if you are going to use social media, this is how, and these are some of the things that you need to be aware of. But certainly in terms of buy-in from senior staff, and by senior staff, let's say the Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner, we have Assistant Commissioners, has been very positive. They're not big social media users themselves in terms of they don't have Twitter accounts with large followers. There's nothing to say that, I don't think there's anything to say that they all have to be doing that, but they certainly understand the benefit of social media. And right from the start were supportive of its use and of us saying things that we perhaps hadn't said previously on different channels. So there was really no obstacle in that. We didn't have to put forward a big argument, and at no point in the first, say, 12 months did anybody come to me and say, "We need you to take down Twitter or Facebook," because they realised straight away the benefit and they saw the pitfalls and the PR disaster of doing something like that. So we're lucky, I suppose, that we didn't have that kind of challenge, and that the senior management team have been very supportive of the London Fire Brigade's development of social media. I think in terms of firefighters, it is something we need to look at. So the Metropolitan Police, for example, have borough commanders who have local Twitter feeds and communicate on a more local basis. We need to look at that. frankly, over the last couple of years, it's been more about resources at the London Fire Brigade, the closure of 10 fire stations, and at the moment we're in a period where the Fire Brigades Union are actually in dispute with the government over changes to pensions. And when you've got big issues like that, it can make it quite difficult to get down to developing different ways of working. And you just have to prioritise what you're going to be doing in the next 12 months around communications. But that doesn't stop the fact that for 2014, one of the plans is most definitely to, once we've completed our review, our 3-year review of social media, look at how it expands. Because at the moment it does sit within the communications department, and we need to look at how it moves into other departments across the organisation, whether that's human resources or whether that is actually borough commanders or firefighters in sort of key areas where we could make it an important part of the way that they interact with the public that they serve. But there's all sorts of work we have to do to bring people up to speed with what social media really is and guidance around how they can use it. Any other?
Shall I go on?
Yeah, go for it.
How are you measuring the outcomes of what you're doing? Because, for example, I know some social media specialists who are, part of their job is looking at outputs, and so I've opened up a new channel of communication with the public with no real thought to the resource that then has to go into maintaining such a, how are you measuring the outcomes as opposed to the outputs?
Well, in terms of fires, let's say, reducing, it's quite limited because there are a number of factors as to why fires or types of fires go down. There's fire engineering itself. Buildings that are constructed today are safer than they were in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. They're built with systems that mean that fire is contained within compartments. So there are factors like that to consider. And I have to say that at this time, I still think that if I were to add to a corporate plan that the London Fire Brigade has reduced certain behaviours of fires through social media, I think that's where I could be straddling into tricky territory, because I think there'd be a lot of people saying that there are a number of other factors, for example fire engineering, that count. But I think what we have been able to do so far is stand up an argument as to why it supports everything else that we're doing. Because even if it in itself isn't reducing a type of fire, what it's doing is providing a space for that type of fire to be discussed, and it's generating much, much greater awareness using a channel and a tone of voice that people tune into, more so than me putting an advert in a local newspaper, for example, that would only hit certain audiences and would only be perceived in a certain way. I think in terms of other measurements, what we have done is we've not really got to measuring sort of the emotion of social media. We're not that sophisticated. Funnily enough, one of the things you said there was lots of social media specialists. We're not social media specialists. As I mentioned, we're a communications team that have diversified and developed social media tools. And we haven't got the resources to buy in social media specialists. So what we have done is captured examples of where there's been real benefit through debate, conversation, and the sharing of information, which shows our workforce just why it is so useful. Any other questions?
Something I was speaking to some people from Scottish Fire Services in a session before, and they were saying that basically, as far as they're aware, most of the fires are started within a certain demographic of people, basically. And I'm wondering whether or not through this you think there's any opportunities for targeted awareness campaigns, and whether or not this is the right form of medium for the type of people that they were saying, the demographic, that this is where fires start.
Absolutely. I mean, we use Mosaic, so Experian developed information to actually plan out where risks are in London and how the London Fire Brigade should respond to those risks. So we use that information not just in terms of risk planning, but also in terms of most of our communications. So the more traditional marketing, let's say, we would use that information to look at the best way of reaching people. So certainly we'd tap into, I mentioned the sort of younger people who tend to go home, get drunk, have fires, which is a sweeping generalisation, I know, but the point being that there are certain types of people and behaviours that we know exist and that we do target in different ways. And I think, again, that's one of the things with social media that, if you like, it's, again, a bit of a sweeping generalisation, but there's that kind of group of people that will use social media who won't pick up a local newspaper or who won't interact with our website traditionally, probably wouldn't think of going to the London Fire Brigade website for anything more than perhaps, can I become a firefighter? And we're tapping into that. And certainly next year, one of the pieces of work that we'll be developing, or are developing at the moment, is a campaign targeted at people who live in purpose-built blocks, so flats and maisonettes in purpose-built blocks. And that's a piece of work that falls out of the Lacanau fire, which I'm not sure if people will be aware of, but there was a fire in 2009 in which 6 people died. And there was an inquest this year, and the inquest, the coroner made some recommendations on how information for people living in that type of property could be improved. And so certainly what we're looking at the moment is a campaign, and just in the way that we would look at any campaign, the different channels that we would normally use, social media obviously plays a big part of that. So, you know, there is actually a whole social media feed in terms of what are we going to be doing with Facebook and Twitter, but also what other platforms are we going to be developing. You know, are there other things that we could be tapping into now as an organisation that we haven't already? So definitely, it's part of the way that we plan our entire fire and rescue service, which goes some way to, I often get sort of slightly puzzled looks when I talk about social media as being so integral to an emergency service, but we almost follow the same pattern as the organisation in terms of how it determines risk and what its priorities are going to be. We would actually follow that same process in terms of our communications and how we plan them. So again, going back to the mosaic information, we know what types of media certain groups will follow. We know what types of behaviours some of those groups generalising tend to display, and we match that with the types of fires that they have. So in the past we've had fires aimed at young people which have been very much about cooking, you know, cooking safety and what you can do. And a couple of years ago we ran a campaign about grabbing a burger when you're out with your friends late at night, rather than going home and getting drunk. We upset an awful lot of people by suggesting that you don't eat healthy food, you grab a nasty old burger or a kebab, and that, you know, that obviously generated a bit of a discussion as well. But what we were actually saying there was, you know, you're going to be safer doing that, much safer doing that, than you are going home and cooking chips. But you can see automatically there's that kind of tone and the sorts of incidents that we're able to talk about, which resonate and work so well with certain social media platforms, just in the way that they're spread virally. Thank you for your questions. Happy to answer any more.
I'm out. Does anybody else want to work?
Okay. In which case, I think I'll probably just wrap this session up, and thank you very much for your time.